History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 5 The Making of the European Age. Chapter 3 The New World of Great Powers. Among the institutions which took their basic shape in the 15th and 16th centuries and are still with us today are those of resident diplomacy. Rulers had sent long messages to one another and negotiated, but there were always many ways of doing this and of understanding what was going on. The Chinese, for example, used the fiction that their emperor was ruler of the world and that all embassies to him were therefore of the nature of petitions or tributes by subjects. Medieval kings had sent one another heralds about whom a special ceremonial had grown up and whom special rules protected, or occasional missions of ambassadors. After 1500, it slowly became the practice to use in peacetime the standard device we still employ of a permanently resident ambassador through whom all ordinary business is at least initially transacted and who has the task of keeping his own rulers informed about the country to which he is accredited. The Venetian ambassadors were the first notable examples. It is not surprising that a republic so dependent on trade and the maintenance of regular relationships should have provided the first examples of the professional diplomat. More changes followed. Gradually, the hazards of the life of earlier emissaries were forgotten as diplomats were given a special status protected by privileges and immunities. The nature of treaties and the other diplomatic forms also became more precise and regularized. Procedure became more standardized. All changes came about slowly when they were believed to be useful. For the most part, it is true, the professional diplomat in the modern sense had not yet appeared by 1800. Ambassadors were then still usually noblemen who could afford to sustain a representative role, not paid civil servants. Nonetheless, the professionalization of diplomacy was beginning. It is another sign that after 1500, a new world of relationships between sovereign powers was replacing that of feudal ties between persons and the vague supremacies of pope and emperor. The most striking characteristic of this new system is the expression it gave to the assumption that the world is divided into sovereign states. The idea took time to emerge. 16th century Europe was certainly not seen by contemporaries as a set of independent areas which governed a ruler of its own, belonging to it alone. Still, less were its components thought to have in any but a few cases any sort of unity which might be called national. That this was so was not only because of the survival of such museums of the past practices as the Holy Roman Empire. It was also because the dominating principle of early modern Europe's diplomacy was dynasticism. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the political units of Europe were less states than landed estates. They were accumulations of property put together over long or short periods by aggressiveness, marriage, and inheritance, by the same process and forces, that is to say, by which any private family's estate might be built up. The results were to be seen on maps whose boundaries continually changed as this or that portion of an inheritance passed from one ruler to another. The inhabitants had no more to say in the matter that might the peasants living on a farm which changed hands. Dynasticism accounts for the monotonous preoccupation of negotiations and treaty making, with the possible consequences of marriages and the careful establishment and scrutiny of lines of succession. Besides their dynastic interests, rulers also argued and fought about religion and increasingly trade or wealth. Some of them acquired overseas possessions. This too became a complicating factor. Occasionally, the old principles of feudal superiority might still be invoked. There were also always map making forces at work which fell outside the operation of these principles, such as settlement of new land or awakening national sentiment. Nevertheless, broadly speaking, most rulers in the 16th and 17th centuries saw themselves as the custodians of inherited rights and interests which they had to pass on. In this, they behaved as was expected. They mirrored the attitudes of other men and other families in their society. It was not only the Middle Ages which were fascinated by lineage, and the 16th and 17th centuries were the great age of genealogy. In 1500, the dynastic map of Europe was about to undergo a major transformation. For the next 2 centuries, two great families were to dispute much of Europe as they were already at that date disputing Italy. These were the House of Habsburg and the ruling House of France. First, Valois, then, after the accession of Henry IV in 1589, Bourbon. The one would come to be the predominantly Austrian, and the other's center would always be France. But both would export rulers and consorts of rulers to many other countries. The heart of their quarrel when the 16th century began was the Burgundian inheritance. Each of them was then far from playing a wider European role. Indeed, there was not a great deal to distinguish them at that date in power, though much in antiquity. From other dynasties, the Welsh Tudors, for example, whose first ruler, Henry VII, had ascended the throne of England in 1485. Only in England, France, and perhaps Spain and Portugal could there be discerned any real national cohesion and sentiment to sustain political unity. England, a relatively unimportant power, was a well developed example. Insular, secluded from invasion, and rid after 1492 of continental appendages, other than the seaport of Calais, finally lost only in 1558. Her government was unusually centralized. The Tudors, anxious to assert the unity of the kingdom after the long period of disorder, labeled the Wars of the Roses, consciously associated national interest with that of the dynasty. Shakespeare's quite naturally uses the language of patriotism, and it may be remarked says little about religious differences. France, too, had already come some way along the road to national cohesion. The House of Valois Bourbon had greater problems than the Tudors, though, in the continued survival of immunities and privileged enclaves within its territories, over which its monarchs did not exercise full sovereignty as kings of France. Some of their subjects did not even speak French. Nevertheless, France was well on the way to become a national state. So was Spain, though its two crowns were not united until the grandson of the Catholic monarchs, Charles of Habsburg, became co ruler with his insane mother in 1516 as Charles I. He had still carefully to distinguish the rights of Castile from those of Aragon, but Spanish nationality was made more self conscious during his reign because, although at first popular, Charles obscured the national identity of Spain in a larger Habsburg empire and indeed sacrificed Spanish interests to dynastic aims and triumphs. The great diplomatic event of the first half of the century was his election in 1519 as Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. He succeeded his grandfather Maximilian, who had sought his election and careful marriages in the past, had by then already made him the ruler of the furthest flung territorial empire the world had ever seen. to which the imperial title supplied a fitting crown. From his mother, he inherited the Spanish kingdoms and therefore both the Aragonese interest in Sicily and the Castilian in the newly discovered Americas. From his father, Maximilian's son, came the Netherlands, which had been part of the Duchy of Burgundy, and from his grandfather, the Habsburg lands of Austria and the Tyrol with Franche Comté, Alsace, and a bundle of claims in Italy. This was the greatest dynastic accumulation of the age, and the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary were held by Charles's brother Ferdinand, who was to succeed him as emperor. Habsburg preeminence was the central fact of European politics for most of the 16th century. Its real and unreal pretensions are well shown in the list of Charles's titles when he ascended the imperial throne: King of the Romans, Emperor elect, Semper Augustus, King of Spain, Sicily, Jerusalem, the Balearic Islands, the Canary Islands, the Indies, and the mainland of the far side of the Atlantic, Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, Brabant, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, Luxembourg, Limburg, Athens, and Patras, Count of Habsburg, Flanders, and Tyrol, Count Palatine of Burgundy, Hainaut-Furt, Roussillon, Landgrave of Alsace, Count of Swabia, Lord of Asia and Africa. Whatever this conglomeration represented, it was not nationality. It fell for practical purposes into two main blocks: the Spanish inheritance, rich through the possession of the Netherlands and irrigated by a growing flow of bullion from the Americas, and the old Habsburg lands, demanding an active role in Germany to maintain the family's preeminence there. Charles, though, saw from his imperial throne much more than this. Revealingly, he liked to call himself God's standard bearer and campaigned like a Christian paladin of old against the Turk in Africa and up and down the Mediterranean. In his own eyes, he was still the medieval emperor, much more than one ruler among many. He was leader of Christendom and responsible only to God for his charge. He may have felt he had a better claim to be called defender of the faith than his Tudor rival Henry VIII, another aspirant to the imperial throne. Germany, Spain, and Habsburg dynastic interest were all to be sacrificed in some degree to Charles's vision of his role. Yet, what he sought was impossible. To rule such an empire was a dream and beyond the powers of any man, given the strains imposed by the Reformation and the inadequate apparatus of 16th century communication and administration. Charles, moreover, strove to rule personally, traveling ceaselessly in pursuit of this futile aim, and thereby, perhaps, he ensured also that no part of his empire, unless it was the Netherlands, felt identified with his house. His aspiration reveals the way in which the medieval world still lived on, but also his anachronism. The Holy Roman Empire was, of course, distinct from Habsburg family possessions. It too embodied the medieval past, but at its most worm eaten and unreal. Germany, where most of it lay, was a chaos supposedly united under the emperor and his tenants in chief, the imperial diet. Since the Golden Bull, the seven electors were virtually sovereign in their territories. There were also 100 princes and more than 50 imperial cities, all independent. Another 300 or so minor starlets and imperial vassals completed the patchwork, which was what was left of the early medieval empire. As the 16th century began, an attempt to reform this confusion and give Germany, some measure of national unity failed. This suited the lesser princes and the cities. All that emerged were some new administrative institutions. Charles's election as emperor in 1519 was by no means a foregone conclusion. Rightly, people feared that German interests in the huge Habsburg dominion might be overridden or neglected. Heavy bribery of the electors was needed before he prevailed over the King of France, the only other serious candidate, for nobody believed that Henry VIII, although a runner, would be able to pay enough. Habsburg dynastic interest was therefore the only unifying principle at work in the Holy Roman Empire until its abolition in 1806. Italy, one of the most striking geographical unities in Europe, was also still fragmented into independent states, most of them ruled by princely despots, and some of them dependencies of external power. The Pope was a temporal monarch in the states of the Church. A king of Naples, of the House of Aragon, ruled that country. Sicily belonged to his Spanish relatives. Venice, Genoa, and Lucca were republics. Milan was a large duchy of the Po Valley ruled by the Sforza family. Florence was theoretically a republic, but from 1509, really a monarchy in the hands of the Medici, a former banking house. In North Italy, the Dukes of Savoy ruled Piedmont, on the other side of the Alps, from their own ancestral lands. The divisions of the peninsula made it an attractive prey, and a tangle of family relationships gave French and Spanish rulers excuses to dabble in the affairs there. For the first half of the 16th century, the main theme of European diplomatic history is provided by the rivalry of Habsburg and Bourbon, above all in Italy. The Habsburg Valois Wars in Italy, which began in 1494 with the French invasion, reminiscent of medieval adventuring and raiding, decked out as a crusade, lasted until 1559. There were altogether six so called Italian wars, and they were more important than they might at first appear. They constitute a distinct period in the evolution of the European state system. Charles V's accession and the defeat of Francis in the imperial election brought out the lines of dynastic competition more clearly. To Charles, the ruler of the empire, they were a fatal distraction from the Lutheran problem in Germany, and to Charles, the King of Spain, the start of a fatal draining of that country's power. To the French, they brought impoverishment and invasion, and to their kings, in the end, frustration. For Spain was left the dominant in Italy. To the inhabitants of that country, the wars brought a variety of disasters. For the first time since the age of the barbarian invasions, Rome was sacked in 1527 by a mutinous imperial army, and Spanish hegemony finally ended the great days of the city republics. At one time, the coasts of Italy were raided by French and Turkish ships in concert. The hollowness of the unity of Christendom was revealed by a formal alliance of a French king with the Sultan. Perhaps these were good years only for the Ottomans. Venice, usually left to face the Turks alone, watched her empire in the eastern Mediterranean begin to crumble away. Spanish, enthralled by the mirage of dominating Italy and the illusions bred by a seemingly endless flow of treasure from the Americas, had abandoned their earlier Moroccan conquests. Both Charles V and his son were defeated in African enterprises, and while defeat of the Turks at Lepanto in 1571 was only a momentary success, 3 years later they took back Tunis from the Spanish. The struggle with the Ottomans and the support of the Habsburg cause in Italy had, by then, overburdened even Spain's wealth. In his last years, Charles V was crippled by debt. He abdicated in 1556, just after the first settlement at Augsburg of the religious disputes of Germany, to be succeeded as emperor by his brother, who took the Austrian inheritance, and as a ruler of Spain by his son, Philip II, a Spaniard born and bred. Charles had been born in the Netherlands, and the ceremony which ended the great emperor's reign took place there in the Hall of the Golden Fleece. He was moved to tears as he left the assembly, leaning on the shoulder of a young nobleman, William of Orange. This division of Habsburg inheritance marks the watershed of European affairs in the 1550s. What followed was the blackest period of Europe's history for centuries. With a brief lull as it opened, European rulers and their people indulged in the 17th century in an orgy of hatred, bigotry, massacre, torture, and brutality, which has no parallel until the 20th. The dominating facts of this period were the military preeminence of Spain, the ideological conflict opened by the Counter Reformation, the paralysis of Germany, and for a long time, France, by internal religious quarrels, the emergence of new centers of power in England, the Dutch Netherlands, and Sweden, and the first adumbrations of the overseas conflict of the next 2 centuries. Only with the end of this period did it appear that the power of Spain had dwindled and that France had inherited her continental ascendancy. The best starting point is the Dutch Revolt. Like the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, it mixed up outsiders in a confusion of ideological, political, strategic, and economic quarrels. France could not be easy, while Spanish armies might invade her from Spain, Italy, and Flanders. England's involvement arose in other ways. Though Protestant, she was only just Protestant, and Philip tried to avoid an outright break with Elizabeth I. He was, for a long time, unwilling to sacrifice the chance of reasserting the English interest he had won by marriage to Mary Tudor, and at first thought to retain them by marrying a second English queen. Moreover, he was long distracted by campaigns against the Ottomans. But national and religious feeling were inflamed in England by Spanish responses to English piracy at the expense of the Spanish Empire. Anglo Spanish relations decayed rapidly in 1570s and 1580s. Elizabeth overtly and covertly helped the Dutch, whom she did not want to see go under, and did so without enthusiastic effort. Being a monarch, she did not like rebels. In the end, armed with papal approval for the deposition of Elizabeth, the heretic queen, a great Spanish invasion effort was mounted in 1588. God blew and they were scattered, said the inscription on an English commemorative medal. Bad weather completed the work of Spanish planning and English seamanship and gunnery, though not a ship on either side was actually sunk by gunfire to bring the Armada to disaster. War with Spain went on long after its scattered remnants had limped back to Spanish harbors, but a great danger was over. Also, almost incidentally, an English naval tradition of enormous importance was born. James I strove sensibly to avoid a renewal of the conflict once peace had been made and succeeded, for all the anti Spanish prejudices of his subjects. England was not sucked into the continental conflict when the revolt of the Netherlands, reignited after a 12 years truce, was merged into a much greater struggle, the 30 Years' War. As its heart was a Habsburg attempt to rebuild the imperial authority in Germany by linking it with the triumph of the Counter Reformation. This called in question the peace of Augsburg and the survival of a religiously pluralistic Germany. It was seen too as an attempt to buttress an overambitious House of Habsburg. Once again, cross currents confused the pattern of ideological conflict. As Habsburgs and Valois had disputed Italy in the 16th century, Habsburg and Bourbon disputed Germany in the next. Dynastic interest brought Catholic France into the field against the Catholic Habsburg. Under the leadership of a cardinal, the eldest daughter of the church, as France was claimed to be, allied with Dutch Calvinists and Danish and Swedish Lutherans to assure the rights of German princes. Meanwhile, the unhappy inhabitants of much of the Central Europe had often to endure the whims and rapacities of quasi independent warlords. Cardinal Richelieu had a better claim than any other man to be the creator of a foreign policy of stirring up trouble beyond the Rhine, which was to serve France well for over a century. If anyone still doubted it, with him, the age of realpolitik and raison d'etre, of simple, unprincipled assertion of the interest of the sovereign state, had clearly arrived. The Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War in 1648, was in several ways a registration of change. Yet, it showed traces still of the fading past. This makes it a good vantage point. It was the end of the era of religious wars in Europe. For the last time, European statesmen had as one of their main concerns in a general settlement the religious future of their peoples. It also marked the end of Spanish military supremacy and of the dream of reconstituting the empire of Charles V. It closed, too, an era of Habsburg history. In Germany, a new force had appeared in the electorate of Brandenburg, and which later Habsburgs would contend, but the frustration of Habsburg aims in Germany had been the work of outsiders, Sweden and France. Here was the real sign of the future. A period of French ascendancy was beginning in Europe west of the Elbe. In a still longer perspective, it opened a period during which the underlying issues of European diplomacy were to be the balance of power in Europe, but both East and West, the fate of the Ottoman Empire, and the distribution of global power. A century and a half after Columbus, though, when Spain, Portugal, England, France, and Holland all already had important overseas empires, these were apparently of no interest to the authors of the Peace of 1648. England was not even represented at either of the centers of negotiation. She had hardly been concerned in events once the first phase of the war was over. Preoccupied by internal quarrels and troubled by her Scottish neighbours, her foreign policy was directed towards the end more extra European than European, though it was these ends which soon led her to the fight with Dutch 1652 to 1654. Although Cromwell quickly restored peace, telling the Dutch there was room in the world for both of them to trade, English and Dutch diplomacy was already showing more clearly than that of other nations the influence of commercial and colonial interest.